Текст моєї доповіді присвячений ідеологіям. Ми обговорювали ще на самому початку, підготовчому етапі до цієї конференції. Мав би відбити те занепокоєння, ті дискусії, які ведуться в дуже різних церковних середовищах, в різних церквах. Ми говорили про те, що тема ідеології є актуальною і для Української церкви в Україні, вона є актуальною для Української церкви в Канаді, вона є актуальною для дуже багатьох контекстів і є, власне, універсальною. Але я спробую якраз і з такої загальної точки зору підійти до цього питання і конкретизувати його, сфокусувавшись більше на українській ситуації. Було до мене прохання від організаторів конференції робити проповідь англійською мовою, тому, власне, я так і буду робити, і переклад український також буде у вас, ви можете слідкувати. The topic of the paper is ideologies, new dividing lines in the church. And I would like to start with the quote from the famous political theologian of the 20th century, Carl Schmitt. If Carl Schmitt was right that all, I quote him, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, end of quote, then this dictum is applicable primarily to ideologies. Ideology is a secularized substrate of theology. Like the latter, it offers a holistic worldview, easily mobilizes masses, and acts with the power of a myth. In this sense, it is, I quote Daniel Bell, his famous book, The End of an Ideology, written as early as 1960, which became a kind of a milestone in the development and reception of the concept of ideology in the Western intellectual circles. So, quoting Daniel Bell, we can see that ideology is a secular religion with its own priests, the intellectuals. So the intellectuals are the priests of the ideologies. Ideology can act as a supplement to religion or as its replacement. Ideology was invented in the end of the 18th century as an alternative to religion and was intended to exercise the same impact on people's mind and behavior. The French philosopher Antoine de Tracy, who coined the term ideology, used les éléments d'idéologie as a foundation for the secular epistemology. Being a faithful follower of the Enlightenment, de Tracy constructed ideology as a way of cognition of the truth without engaging what he called the religious bias. Ideology thus, at its very inception, was anti-religious. Almost half a century later, in the works of Karl Marx, ideology re-emerged, now itself an object of criticism for bias and distortion of reality. From an accusing part, ideology turned to an accused part. Marx, in his work Die Deutsche Ideologie, published in 1846, criticized not the religion, but the German idealistic philosophy for misrepresenting the reality. The point of Marx was that when the picture of the reality is drawn on the basis of ideas alone, something that the idealist philosophers tended to do, then it produces only false consciousness. The true picture of reality can be drawn only when it is based on the social and economic interests of the classes. For Marx, ideologies covered the interests of those social groups that were in hold of political power and of capital. Although Marx greatly relied on the atheism of Ludwig Feuerbach, he did not clearly reject religion. On the one hand, religion was for him a form of ideology that distorted reality. On the other hand, his attitude to materialism was dialectical. He criticized Feuerbach for the idea of unilateral dominance of the material over the ideal. There is a book published, which has been published relatively recently, which explores this dialectical approach of Marx to religion, also from the perspective of ideology. Marxism has demonstrated that fighting ideologies is similar to hunting dragons, according to the play of Evgeny Schwartz, Dracon, which he composed in 1942-44, and which became a basis for a famous movie, To Kill a Dragon. The dragon hunters often turn to dragons and become worse than the ones they had fought. Marxism, that wrestled with the idealist ideologies, turned to ideology itself. In its Soviet edition, it became a totalitarian ideocracy. Fascism of different modifications that came to power on the pretext of fighting against communism also turned to a totalitarian ideology, as Hannah Arendt has famously demonstrated this in a number of books. Ideologies became a blueprint for gigantic projects of social engineering in the 20th century and ended as bloodbaths with millions of human lives sacrificed to their ideas. As Isaiah Berlin put it, and I'd like to quote him rather extensively, Isaiah Berlin said that the great ideological storms of the 20th century have altered the lives of virtually all mankind. The Russian Revolution and its aftermath, totalitarian tyrannies of both right and left, and the explosions of nationalism, racism, and in places of religious bigotry, which are, interestingly enough, not one among the most perceptive social thinkers of the 19th century had ever predicted. When our descendants in 2 or 3 centuries' time, if mankind survives until then, come to look at our age, it is these two phenomena that will, I think, be held to be the outstanding characteristics of our century, the most demanding of explanation and analysis. But it is as well to realize that these great movements began with ideas in people's heads, ideas about what relations between men have been, are, might be, and should be, and to realize how they came to be transformed in the name of a vision of some supreme goal in the minds of the leaders, above all of the prophets with armies at their backs. End of quote. The tragic consequences of the totalitarian ideologies led to the crisis of ideology as a genre. In 1960, as I mentioned, Daniel Bell wrote a book where he declared that ideology by his time had been over. In some sense, he was right, as the ideology had indeed lost its magics over the minds of people, at least in the West. This happened largely owing to the advances of postmodernism, which emerged in the beginning of the century, but came to power after the World War II. Postmodernism is not just another philosophical doctrine, but a discourse communicated through the means of philosophy, literature, theater, cinema, etc. By this means, it has penetrated into every pore of the intellectual and cultural life of the West. One of the reasons why postmodernism was constructed and promoted was to weaken the grip of the totalitarian ideologies on the masses. Ideology and postmodernism excluded each other by definition, At least this was the intention behind the latter, behind the postmodernism. However, as it happened to all ideology hunters, postmodernism gradually began turning to an ideology itself, with relativism as one of the elements of the ideological approach to the reality. This feature of postmodernism scares many in the realm of religion and theology, and not completely without good reasons. However, the postmodern relativism is two-edged. Although it may challenge the integrity of the theological doctrine, it can also help it to get rid of the traces of the totalitarian ideologies. In their struggle for human minds and souls, the totalitarianisms of the 20th century either allied with or attacked religion. In both cases, however, they infected religion with ideologies. Postmodernism has a power to liberate the church from the impact of the totalitarian doctrines. Of course, postmodernism cannot supply the church with truth. It helps, however, the church to clear its own sources of truth by impeding the secular ideas turning into theological maxims or objects into idols, to use the words of Graham Ward in his introduction to the Blackwell Companion to Postmodern Theology. The end of ideology started a new epoch, which became dominated by the ideologies of a new kind. At the turn of this epoch, Samuel Huntington, as early as in 1957, defined ideology as, I quote, a system of ideas concerned with the distribution of political and social values and acquiesced with by a significant social group. End of quote. It was presented as, again I quote, one of the basic forms of social cognition that at the same time defined the identity of a group, and as a cultural software that helps the society to reflect on itself and to develop social and political action. In this sense, ideology became a more neutral and descriptive concept applicable to a wide array of social phenomena. From a philosophical category connected with the Marxist and the neo-Marxist discussions, it evolved to a sociological category. The next stage in the evolution of ideology unfolded in the context of the American political science and sociology. American scholars like Philip Converse and Anthony Downs developed it as a binary of liberalism-conservatism. This new ideological framework reflected the American political system with two antagonist parties, the Democratic and the Republican. The ideological bipolarity of liberal-conservative was tuned up to fit the American two-parties political system. The dilemma of liberalism versus conservatism is thus reductionist and neglecting many in-between tints of the ideological spectrum. In this bipolar framework, the liberals, who are supposed to support the Democratic Party, share the concern for social progress and human betterment, especially for the poor and powerless. They believe that the well-being of a person is conditioned by the state. Therefore, they advocate constant political and social reforms as a way to improve the human condition. They acknowledge the potential perfectibility of man and his capacity to manage his own affairs in a responsible and reasoned fashion. The bottom line of liberalism is that all individuals are in theory free and equal, and liberalism therefore refuses to accept that repressive hierarchies are natural. Conservatism historically developed as a criticism of liberalism. Its founder is usually considered Edmund Burke, an Irish statesman who lived between 1729 and died in 1797, and later he became a member of the House of Commons and the Whig Party in Britain. Burke criticized the French Revolution and the social contract theory articulated particularly by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In its present state, conservatism holds that most people need strong leaders, firm laws and institutions, and strict moral codes to keep their appetites under control. According to the conservative credo, conventional norms and practices are essential to human well-being. While liberals normally do not object when their doctrine is referred to as an ideology, the conservatives often do. They don't like when they are called kind of ideology man. The distinction between liberalism and conservatism is helpful for understanding the current American political landscape. However, it may be confusing in explaining the past of the American political system. Thus, the American liberals historically, well, you will be surprised, supported slavery as a part of the property right. They advocated elitism, patriarchy, colonialism, and only in the 20th century they came to support the democratic political system. Well, one is really surprised to know that. At the same time, the modern American conservatism, in the form of neoconservative doctrine, in effect, claims going back to the classical liberal ideas of the founding fathers in their purest form. So the latest version of conservatism is essentially the earliest version of liberalism. That is one of the paradoxes of this ideology. The binary of conservatism and liberalism can be even more confusing in explaining global ideologies. Thus, for instance, within the same Marxism, one can distinguish both liberalism and conservatism. The former, for instance, represented by Leninism as a kind of liberal version of Marxism, and the latter, the conservative Marxism, by Stalinism. And we see that if we consider Leninism and Stalinism as different editions of Marxism, it is confusing because, well, we cannot then explain many things in the history, but when we consider them from the perspective of liberal and conservative approach, we definitely see how different, how even opposite to each other they are. Despite all its limitations and the America-based agenda, the distinction between liberalism and conservatism is helpful in examining relationship between the global ideologies and theology. Liberalism and conservatism correlate, well, but should not be fully identified with the two universal attitudes to the human nature and human communities, including society and the church, which can be characterized as open and closed. The open, so to say, liberal attitude to the human nature and community is inclusive, extrovert, and centrifugal. It is eager to discover new territories and trusts that what is to be discovered there is good. The closed or conservative attitude does not trust the new experiences as much. Its main concern is to preserve integrity of the personality and of the community, something that the liberal approach sometimes neglects. In the dilemma of either going further at the risk of losing what he or she has, or to keep the possession without knowing what is beyond the sight, a conservative always chooses the latter. Liberalism and conservatism reflect the two archetypical approaches to organizing the human communities that can be traced throughout the centuries of the human history. These two approaches are rooted in anthropology, which developed around two poles, one pessimistic and the other optimistic. In the Western tradition, these two poles can be approximated to the theological positions of Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. Augustine saw the human nature as deeply corrupted by sin and radically disabled in exercising its activities in a proper way. In order to function normally, it requires intervention of the divine grace. Thomas, although of course recognized the impact of the original sin on the human nature, consider the nature to be more integral and capable of acting in accordance with the natural law. An extreme antithesis to the Augustinian pessimism was the anthropology of the Enlightenment, which radiated an unconditioned optimism about the human nature. At the core of the two anthropological paradigms, pessimistic and optimistic, is the issue of freedom. The optimistic anthropology holds that despite all their imperfection, human beings are capable to handle their freedom in a noble and productive way. There are, of course, abuses of freedom, but they occur because of the very nature of freedom. The freedom cannot be what it is if it does not imply a possibility of abuse or failure. In other words, it is impossible to say yes to God, to self, and to other people without potentiality of saying no. There is no yes without no, as there is no freedom without possibility of fall or failure. Abuses of freedom cannot cancel the freedom as such. The pessimistic anthropology looks at the human freedom with a suspicion, as at a source of evil, which it is indeed. Well, the source of evil is freedom. Those who favor this anthropology try to limit the negative consequences of human freedom by limiting the freedom as such. Sometimes, it reminds an advice how to heal headache. The best way to heal headache is guillotine. So the same approach can be observed in this way of limiting the negative outcomes of freedom, just to limit the freedom as such. So those who advocate this kind of pessimistic approach to the freedom, they invoke fallenness and sin of the human nature as an excuse to impose restrictions on freedom. And actually in the conservative discourse, even in the discourse of the political conservatives, one can often see these references to the sin, to the limitations and corruptedness of the human nature and so forth. So they employ the theological rhetoric sometimes. And the restrictions they want to impose on the freedom can be moral and political. They can be imposed on individuals and on the masses. This anthropology favors different kinds of coercion to correct human behavior and belief. And this is actually a very important key, I think, to understand how we can treat, how we can address the issue of coercion, whether the state is allowed to impose, say, Orthodox doctrine or morality on behalf of the Church upon the citizens, or it's not. The two anthropological approaches project themselves to the political scene as liberal and conservative political doctrines. For the former, the human beings are fundamentally unencumbered in exercising their freedom and rationality. As a result, they do not require paternalism from the state. In contrast to that, the political conservatism builds on the argument about the corrupted soul after the fall from the paradise. And actually, I'm quoting the Encyclopedia of Social Theory, a secular reference book, and interestingly that they exactly employ the rhetorical theology to explain the background of the political conservatism. It develops a profoundly pessimistic view of the human condition, which has been profoundly affected by the original sin. The same source, the same Encyclopedia of Social Theory. Well, an alternative to the radically pessimistic and radically optimistic anthropological poles developed in the West can be the Eastern Christian anthropology. Its mainstream was probably best articulated by the Byzantine monk Maximus the Confessor, who flourished in the first half of the 7th century. In the course of the controversies concerning the activities and wills of Christ, he suggested that sin affects not so much the human nature as such, but what he called gnomic will of a person. The gnomic will is a function of the human mind, nous, and is subject to ignorance, doubts, and an opposition of opinions and evaluations. So it's not the entire nature is, is producing bad things, but it is a particular, very limited part of this nature which is responsible for failures of the human nature, according to Maximus. And the corruptedness of the human nature is concentrated in the deciding and willing part of it, where the freedom resides, not everywhere, while the nature in total remains a good creature of God. The Eastern anthropology had its own extremes. The monophysite, so to say, monophysite, I don't like this word, but because it's technical. And the Nestorian, I don't like this word either because it's also misleading, but nevertheless, because it is technical, we may use it. The former, the monophysite anthropology, was developed by the Byzantine monk Eutychius, who lived in the first half of the 5th century, who believed that the human nature was so imperfect that it had to mix up with the divine in order to be saved. This anthropology stood not far from the Augustine's one, though was expressed in different terms. Speaking very roughly, this monophysite anthropology is very close to the conservative perception of the human nature, which can be also projected as a political conservatism. Well, you can say it's too far, to make these kind of connections, but I think there is an anthropological hint in this, and in the East, it was expressed by Eutychius. The other extreme was articulated by the Syrian theologian Theodore of Mopsuestia, who lived also, who was just one generation earlier than Eutychius, and who was promoted, and this theology and this anthropology was promoted by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Nestorius, who was not smart enough to develop a distinct theology. He just borrowed the theology of Theodore of Mopsuestia and promoted it as a universal doctrine, and for this reason he was condemned. According to this position, according to this anthropology, the human nature does not require intervention of the divine in order to be sound. Human beings can improve with their own effort, following the moral example of Christ. Well, again, speaking about speculatively, I would say that this anthropological position could be appreciated by Rousseau and his confederates. You see the connection between Nestorius and Jean-Jacques Rousseau on the one hand, and the connection between Eutychius and, say, I don't know, George W. Bush. Sorry for that. I know that it's too much, but it's funny at least. And there is a connection. One could expect that the well-balanced Maximian anthropology of the Eastern Church would have produced a model of statehood that would be more appreciative of the human freedom and dignity. Indeed, if we see that the political doctrines reflect the anthropological paradigms in the Western civilization, it would be very tempting to wish that our Eastern Orthodox balanced anthropology would incarnate into a very healthy statehood, which is not the case, as we know. As we know, the Eastern type of state became notoriously abusive of the human rights and assaulting for the human dignity. The explanation of this striking incoherence between the anthropological and political models in the East is that the latter, the political models, were built not on anthropology, but on cosmology. Indeed, the Eastern Christendom adopted the Neoplatonic model of universe, which features a strict hierarchism and subordination as a pattern to build relations between the state and its subjects. So in the basement of the Eastern statehood idea of state, and consequently the Eastern idea of the church-state relations, is not anthropology but cosmology and the Neoplatonic perception of the cosmos, which disregards human beings, which values the structures, superhuman structures, like, well, the universe. The same is the state as the universe, inhabited, almost empty, Newtonian universe, if you wish. At the core of all anthropological models of the modern political system is the issue of freedom, as I said, and freedom is a keyword of our time, as logos was a keyword of antiquity, and reason was the keyword of the period of enlightenment. And I'm speaking now about the projections of freedom to the political plane. Liberal models consider the personal freedom an ultimate value which needs to be protected from the state and any other agent. These models, however, often vulgarize freedom and reduce it to the freedom of choice. The more choices a person has, the freer he or she is believed to be. It's like in a supermarket. The larger is the supermarket, the more choices you have, the freer, well, you feel. And this is a very reductionist. It's not a bad idea of freedom, of course, but it's a very limited idea of freedom in comparison with what Christianity believes the freedom to be. The conservative, so to say, models of freedom also accept the value of personal freedom, at least especially in the context of the victorious liberal democracy. Well, no one conservative, even the Tea Party people, cannot say that freedom is bad because the rules of game is like this. They believe, however, that serious reservations about ability of a person to handle freedom is needed. They believe that the state should be authorized to control the limits of the human freedom. There is a kind of extreme version of this conservative approach to freedom, which we can observe in fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is an interesting phenomenon, kind of interreligious phenomenon, universal phenomenon, which we can observe not only in the Orthodox Church. Well, we are always complaining about fundamentalism in our circles, but it's a universal phenomenon. And as you know, there is there was a wonderful research project undertaken by a group of scholars under the leadership of Martin Marty at the University of Chicago, which explored in 5 volumes different manifestations of fundamentalism in different religious traditions. And this is a remarkable proof that, well, this is a universal phenomenon. It's not just confessional or whatever, but it happens everywhere. And it has to do exactly with the idea of freedom. And the fundamentalist approach to the human freedom is even less tolerable than the conservative one. According to this approach, the freedom of an individual should be controlled not by the state, but by the community. And this sort of control is even tougher than the conservative wish to control freedom by the state. The two ideological approach, the liberal and the conservative approaches to the freedom disagree on the issue of freedom. Each of them tries to impose its own interpretation of the human freedom and nature. A totality of either liberal or conservative anthropological model threatens the integrity of the community and personality correspondingly. I mean, when one of the approaches wins, becomes the only possible one, without taking into consideration the other approach, by claiming exclusivity, this really is dangerous, and it threatens both the integrity of the personality, in terms that, well, the personality just, the person just cannot cannot develop properly, cannot be faithful to itself, to himself or herself, and on the other hand, an exclusivity of one of the approaches threatens also the integrity of the community, and the community just decays. As Stanley Hovorun put it, I quote, "The problem in liberal societies is that there seems to be no way to encourage the development of public virtue without accepting a totalitarian strategy from the left or an elitist strategy from the right. By standing as an alternative to each, the Church may well help free our social imagination from those destructive choices." Well, this is a very interesting statement by Hovorun, which expresses his ideas about the Church vis-à-vis the society. As we know, Hovorun and the line that he represents, the so-called post-liberal approach, well, which is also famous as a Yale school of post-liberalism, this school somehow undermines the capability of the liberal democracy and counterposes to the society, the Church, as a solution to the social problem. Well, I think it is true what he believes, but I think this is a bit naive. This is a bit over-optimistic about the social capacities of the Church to tackle the social problems. And one of the problems is that there is no one single theological interpretation of what is freedom. The other problem is that it is difficult to translate a healthy theological interpretation of freedom to a political praxis. That is exactly what the churches face. The churches, we all as the church, we have very healthy perceptions of what is human nature and what is freedom. But when it comes to the social presence, appearance of the church, the social praxis of the church within the society, then we face every kind of distortion and every kind of failure. We permanently discuss this. We permanently address these problems of how the church fails to translate its power, its transfigurative power, to the society. And instead of healing the society, it gets infected by the social diseases. And this is where I think Hovorun somehow fails to address this incoherence. And I think it is important to understand this. And this is somehow a key to understand the influence of ideologies back upon the church. So, even though the churches have a huge potentiality to overcome ideologies, they often get trapped in them. And let us consider several cases of how this may happen. The interaction between theology and ideology should be considered in the light of the similarities between them. Ideology in many respects imitates theology and uses its communicative instruments. Historically, their relationship was dialectical, just as relations of Marx with religion. When ideologies emerged from the cradle of theology, which was indeed the case, the latter supplied ideologies with many of its insights and vocabulary. Actually, ideological vocabulary is greatly a religious vocabulary, and the instruments and the mechanisms of exercising impact upon human minds and souls in the church, in the theology, and in ideology are similar. Ideologies emancipated from theology, and as I said at the beginning, ideologies emerged as a rejection of religion. And this happened either radically or moderately. Say, in France, it was a very radical emancipation from religion. In the United States, the American Enlightenment Project was more moderate in distancing from religion, and this is the famous Jeffersonian wording about the wall between the church and the state reflects exactly this kind of moderate, very accurate approach to the church-state relations. And regardless of how far ideology went away from the theology, it came back, and ideology exercised a very heavy impact on theology after it emerged in the 18th century. After the 18th century, the churches, both in the West and in the East, found themselves under the permanent influence of ideologies of all varieties. This happened because the churches traditionally had a significant presence in the political sphere and did not want to leave it. And actually the price to remain in the political sphere, in the public square for the church, starting from the 18th century, was to play by the rules of the game of ideologies, to pay tribute to ideology. The presence of the churches in the political and the presence, therefore, of the churches in the political sphere led to many distortions of the church's purpose and mission. As Darrell Hart has rightly remarked, I quote, where Christians have tried to use their faith for political engagement, they have generally distorted Christianity. End of quote. The ideologized theology often produced this kind of distortion and became a subject to the new rules dictated by ideology. It is common to distinguish ideology from the objective knowledge, and this is a kind of common definition of what is ideology. Ideology distorts the objective knowledge, and this definition started first with Marx. And if we express this relationship between the church and ideology in these Marxian terms, we can say that the theology which is affected by ideology distorts the theological truth of the church. Among the most recent instances of polarization and division of the church under the influence of ideology is Ukraine. And now we come to the core of our topic of our discussion. The country, as you know, we have three churches, which are divided, and well, the discourse, well, the division is somehow postmodern, I would say, because there is a discourse. A postmodern discourse which engages, the canons of the church. But this discourse is not exactly what happens in reality, and I think the real reason of the divisions among the Ukrainian churches are political and ideological, not theological or canonical. The churches are divided along the ideological lines. However, these lines do not exactly go along the borders between conservatism and liberalism, which is a very popular dividing line generally in the churches, in different churches, in the Protestant, the Catholic churches, and so forth. In Ukraine, it's not the case. We are exceptional, of course. And this division started in early 1990s between the pro-Russian and anti-Russian strata of the Ukrainian society after Ukraine gained independence in 1991. It gradually developed into a new form of ideological opposition. In the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in unity with the Moscow Patriarchate, is large, and the majority of its members do not demonstrate their political preferences, which are diverse. Well, it's a different kind of, it's like, like a Noah boat. All kinds of animals are there with different beliefs and credos. Political and ideological credos. However, the most politically active part of this Church is loud in proclaiming the ideas of the political unity with Moscow, advocates the concept of the Russian world, and even the restoration of the Soviet Union. They share conservative and even ultra-conservative views. And that's an interesting thing, that they advocate a kind of political power, political authority, which is not Ukrainian, which is not their local, which is located outside. In this regard, I think they are closer to the fundamentalist approach to the ideology, because for them, the foreign authority of Moscow is very theoretical, not really something that they can feel or touch. It's an idea. It's like, you know, a Kitishgrad, an imagined city of Kitish, which does not exist, but which exists only in the heads of people, and they aspire for an imagined, ideal, you know, El Dorado somewhere to the north of the country. No one really witnessed and experienced that kind of authority. Now they start, and I think they change their mind. But those who haven't experienced it, they really aspire for something that doesn't exist in reality. They run after ideas, and in this regard, they are a fundamentalist faction, not just, you know, conservative, you know, earth-rooted and grounded people. Well, speaking, that's about the Moscow Patriarchate. Many in the Patriarchate of Kiev increasingly demonstrate pro-Western and pro-democracy sympathies. Again, this does not mean that the church, the Patriarchate of Kiev, is a liberal church. No way. But that people with liberal views feel they are more at home than, for instance, in the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate. As for the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, its ideological profile was formed in the Soviet period. This church absorbed the anti-Soviet sentiments and dissidents. This was indeed the church of the intellectuals in the time of the late Brezhnev regime. And this church was probably most ideologically charged. Its ideological position was against the Soviet Union, against the Soviet value. It was more pro-liberal, pro-democracy movement, and it became therefore attractive for intelligentsia in Kiev and elsewhere in Ukraine. It became a kind of you know, high church in terms of ideas and in terms of messages. And this church opposed the presumably Soviet Moscow and the Kiev Patriarchates. Well, we earlier, at the beginning of the division, the Moscow and the Kiev Patriarchate, they share the same fame of being Soviet, you know, churches. Well, with all due respect, but I think it's a kind of social reality. It doesn't mean that it is the same now, because they just changed their positions. The Ukrainian autocephalous church, I think, has lost completely its, you know, charm of anti-Soviet, you know, kind of resistance. And this charm of anti-Soviet resistance went to other churches, well, particularly the Patriarchate of Kiev. And if a position of supporting or advancing Sovietism is ideological, well, to be pro or against the Soviet Union, or the Soviet kind of mythology, is a dividing ideological line, then this is exactly the case with the dividing line between the Ukrainian churches. And I believe that the Ukrainian society, after the events of the Maidan, is divided. Still, I believe it is divided, but it is divided not according to the attitude to Ukraine, but it is divided in accordance with the attitude to the Soviet past or the future of the country. And the churches are divided exactly along the same lines, ideological lines. Well, and hence is the solution. If we step over those ideological lines, this is the way to reconciliation between the churches.